Hi everybody, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm going to be using the Timeless Tulip stamp set by Scrappy Tales, and I'm going to, of course, be creating a one-layer scene. And I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and for the life of me I can't find my T-square ruler, so I'm just using a scrap piece of cardstock as my straight edge. And I was originally going to make this a landscape card, and all I'm really doing is drawing two straight lines to kind of create a table, I guess. And I'm just making the back line a little bit shorter than the front line, or I guess the front of the table, because it would appear smaller as it gets further back. Then I realized that my tulips weren't actually going to fit. This is a huge image. So I ended up flipping my card panel around, and I am going to be creating a portrait card. But I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just creating a straight line in the back and then a diagonal line to connect the back of the table to the front part of the table. You can see I have all of my masks pre-cut with some Simon Says stamp masking paper, and I'm just lining those up onto my card panel just for placement so that I can see what images I'm actually going to be able to fit on here and where I want them to be. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to bring out my mini Misty, and I'm going to leave all of those masks right in place. Then I can determine what needs to be stamped and masked first. So whenever you're creating a scene, you want to make sure that you are stamping and masking whatever images are in front of another. So my first layer, I guess you could say, is going to be this single tulip because it is going to be in front of the vase. I'm also going to have this half a apple here in front of the full apple, so I'm going to have to stamp that first. And this bunch of bananas is going to be in front of this basket of fruit, so that has to be stamped first. Then I can close my Misty door, pick up those first set of stamps there, remove those masks that I was just using for placement. The backing is still on it, and then I can stamp out my images. I am stamping with some blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, and I did end up stamping these twice. Went ahead and masked those out, and then I can move on to my next layer. So I could have probably, if I would have allowed myself a little bit more room, I could have stamped all three, but just the outer edge of the stamps of the fruit basket as well as the vase, they were just too close to one another. Not the images themselves, but the outer edge of the stamp. So I did have to stamp those separately. But once again, I am going to stamp these out twice with the blackout ink and then mask those out. Now for the mask for the vase, you can see that I cut right through that little handle there just to keep that opening. I really didn't need to because I'm not going to be stamping or ink blending behind it, but just to show you how to kind of create those gaps. There are a few gaps between the flowers themselves. I didn't bother to try to cut those out. So finally, I'm going to finish off with this little fruit basket here. Wish I would have stamped this a little bit lower than I did, but it is what it is. Once everything is all said and done, you're really not going to be able to spot too many mistakes. At least the recipient won't. The creator will. So I'm going to mask that out, and then we are going to create our background. And I'm going to create a kind of a tone-on-tone background here. First, I need to reinforce those lines that we created with the pencil. So I'm going to bring out a EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, but you can use any Copic safe pen here just to create that table. Now I'm only going to be doing ink blending for the wall, so I want to make sure that my table itself is masked off. So I'm just using some Post-it note tape here. If you're careful, you really only have to mask the edges, but I don't trust myself to go beyond those edges. So I'm going to use little pieces of Post-it note tape to pretty much cover up the entire table because I don't want to get any ink in places that I don't want it to be. So once that is masked off, I'm going to cut little strips of masking paper, and I'm cutting these 1/4 inch. You can cut these as thick or as thin as you want to, and you can kind of create any pattern that you want to, but I am going to keep this nice and simple. I like to cut mine a lot longer than they need to be. That way they hang off the card panel and kind of stick down to my work surface while I do my ink blending. That's just my preference. You can fold yours over to the back if you prefer, but I'm just using my work surface here, the grid lines on my mat here, to make sure that they are all perfectly lined up. So I like these longer. Not only are they going to kind of make my panel stick down, but I can also kind of extend it on the top and the bottom to make sure that it is completely straight. And again, you can create any pattern here you want. I am just simply creating stripes that are an equal distance apart. You can do them different distances, you can do them different thicknesses, whatever you prefer. I'm just keeping mine nice and simple. So I went ahead and continued masking out the entire background with these little strips of masking paper. Then I can go ahead and do my ink blending. I'm going to be working on a scrap piece of paper here. I prefer to do that for ink blending so that I don't pick up any ink that I don't want to pick up with my ink blending brush. And I'm going to be using some pumice stone. So I'm just going to do my ink blending as normal. I usually will add a little bit of shading towards the bottom. So basically where the wall is right behind the table, and then have it be a little bit lighter as I work my way up. But I'm only using one color here. Well, I was only going to use one color, so I wasn't getting the contrast I was looking for. So I ended up bringing in the black soot. And this is Distress Oxide. So the black soot in Distress Oxide is not really black. It's more of a charcoal gray. But if you go in with an extremely light hand, you're going to get a very light version of that. So I only tapped it and tapped my blending brush onto the ink pad and just added a little bit of dimension there for where the wall is meeting the table, and then kind of just blended that up with the pumice stone. Then I can remove these little stripes. Now you want to be very careful so that you don't remove the masks that you have on the images as you're pulling these up. And also they will be wet from the Distress Oxides, and that can sometimes tear your paper. So you just want to be super careful when you are removing these. Now, in order to create kind of my tone on tone, but still be able to see my stripes, I'm just going to go in with this pumice stone all over the background. I'm going to go right over where I've already done my ink blending, but this will kind of fill in these white areas as well. It's just going to be a much lighter version of the pumice stone, and I'm okay with that. I don't want too much of a pattern because I don't want it to take away from my images themselves, but I want a little bit of something instead of just one solid color in the background. So once I was happy with the amount of color that I had in the background, I can go ahead and remove my masks. Now, once again, you do want to be careful because it is wet from the Distress Oxides, and that can sometimes tear your paper. So you may want to just use some scissors to kind of get it started, or hold your paper up and kind of bend the masks along the paper, if that makes any sense at all. So once my masks were removed, you do want to make sure that you erase any pencil lines that might be showing, because once you color over them, you will not be able to erase them and they will be forever there. So moving on to the coloring, I am going to start off with this basket. Now, I know that images like this, for those of you who may be beginners at coloring or alcohol marker coloring, can be a little intimidating. But the ones with the most details, at least for me, I find the easiest to color because I don't have to think about where to put my shadows. There's so much detail within these images that it kind of guides me as far as where those shadows need to be. So you can see that there's like flick lines within the image, and I'm just using those as my guide. I'm using those to add texture to the images, and I'm also using those to add the contrast and the dimension. I'm just going to create some shadows where some of this fruit is hanging over the basket, but overall this is a round object, so the highlight would be in the center. So I really don't have to think about it too much. And that goes for pretty much all of these images. They look intimidating, but they are, I promise you, the easiest ones to color. So the basket now is done, and you can see that it is a little bit higher up than it should be. The bananas should be a little bit more in front of it, but it is what it is. We're going to move on to the greens, and I'm going to work on this single tulip here, and I'm going to start with my lightest color to get my paper saturated, and I'm going to add some shading kind of in some random areas. And again, I'm just using those images, the image itself, the detail within the image, as my guide as far as where I need to put those little flick lines with the darkest color. You just want to make sure that you're just blending it out a little bit each time you go. I'm also adding a little bit of shading to the base of each one of these leaves. Again, there's detail there. It's probably hard to see on camera, but there are some flick lines there that are already part of the image. So I'm just kind of going with the flow here. Very, very simple. So I'm going to blend that out with my two midtones and finish off with my lightest color, just being careful not to go over my darkest areas with my lightest color. Remember, the lighter the color, the more it will act as a colorless blender. Now for my leaves for my bouquet here, I started with my lightest color and I'm going to fill all of them in. And this is mainly so that I don't lose what is what. There's so much going on in this particular image that I want to make sure that I don't accidentally color something the wrong way. So just by going in with my lightest color first and coloring in all of these leaves, it will kind of guide me as far as what is a leaf and what is a petal. So I'm going to use the same color combination, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing, just using these flick lines within the image as my guide as far as where I need to put my shadows. I am just using the very tip of my marker. I know it's hard to see, but my marker is straight up and down, and that is how you're going to get into those tiny little areas with a brush nib. So I colored the rest of the leaves, and I ended up using the same color combination for the stems as well. And I concentrated my darkest areas being in the center, again, just using the very tip of the marker, and the outer edges should be a little bit lighter. But once I had this all colored and I added all four of my greens, it did blend in a little bit too much with the leaves. If it wasn't for the black outline of the image itself, you really wouldn't be able to tell what is a leaf and what is the stem. So I ended up taking a different green. I took a YG marker and I just went directly over the stems. Now it's not going to make a huge difference, and it might not even be too visible on camera, but it's just going to change it enough where you're going to be able to tell the difference between the two. Now there's also some smaller leaves within the image, and I wanted to use a different color combination just to kind of have a little bit of variation in the colors. So I'm going to switch over to some YG 90 markers, and this is a natural blending family, so they blend very, very nicely. I don't feel the need to go ahead and saturate the paper first. I'm going to go right in with the darkest color, and again, just following those flick lines that are part of the image and using them as my guide where to put the darkest color, and I'm just blending that out a little bit each time. Again, making sure that I don't go over the darkest areas with my lightest color. Now for these little gaps between the leaves that I didn't bother to cut with the mask, I'm just going to go in with a W marker, and you're really never going to know the difference. It just looks like part of the ink blended background. Next, for the bananas, we're going to do the same or something very similar than we did with the stems. So I'm going to go right in with the darkest color, and this is E99. It's very brown, and it's going to look a little bit crazy in the beginning because bananas aren't brown, but I'm just adding my deepest, darkest shadows with this color, again, just using the very tip of the marker. Then I'm going to blend that out with some Y markers, and again, it's going to look a little bit too brownish or golden brownish for bananas. But once I have all of my shading done and all of my contrast added, I'm going to go in with a Y11, which is a bright yellow, and I'm going to go over the entire thing. And this is going to brighten everything up, but still I'm going to be able to keep the shadows that I created. I'm going to use a similar combination for the inside of this apple. If you ever looked at the inside of an apple, there's really not much dimension to begin with, so I really wasn't concerned with getting too much dimension here, but I did add a little bit of shading to the very center of the apple and then kind of just worked my way out from there. Next, I'm going to move on to the pears, and you can see that I'm kind of skipping all over the place. And here's where I struggled a little bit because pears are kind of all different colors, or they can be. And so I kind of picked some random YG markers and kind of just blended them even though they shouldn't be blended, and I actually liked the result. It actually looked like a pear. If you've ever looked at a pear, it is kind of like all different speckled greens, and I think it worked out well. So I just added a little bit of a flick line where it's kind of indented in just to add a little bit of shape to the pear. And I did the same thing for the one in back. And I just added a little bit of a shadow where the front pear is hanging over or hanging in front of this back one. So next I'm going to work on the grapes. And I'm just going to use two different colors here. And I'm just creating a C. Just to see with the darkest color, and I'm just leaving a tiny bit of a white area for each one of these grapes for the lighter color. I'm not adding too much dimension here, but you don't want to color these in solid. Even though I'm only using 2 colors and there's really not much of a difference between the two, you don't want to color them in solid because it's just going to end up looking like a big blob. So for the stems of the apples and the core of the apple, I'm just going to use 2 different colors here. It doesn't really have to have too much dimension. It doesn't in real life anyway. And then we're going to work on the vase, or I guess you could call it a vase. So for these middle areas here, I would envision these being indented in. So they would be a little bit darker than the rest of it. So for these 3 little sections, for the left one, I'm adding a little bit more shading to the left. For the right, I'm adding a little bit more shading to the right. And for the middle one, I'm adding a little bit of shading to both sides. And I'm going to go in with the B99, which is the darkest color that I'm using here. Then I can blend that out with the B97, B95, and B93. Then I can move on to the rest of the vase. Now there's also where that little spout is. I guess it wouldn't be a spout. Would it be a spout? I don't know. The opening. We'll say the opening of the vase here. I am just going to add a little bit of those same darker colors because this would be the inside, so it would naturally be darker. Now this also would be more of a rounder object, so naturally my highlight would be in the center, and I'm going to add a little bit of shading to either side. Now when I add the shading, I'm not going quite as dark as I did for the center area because I want this to stand out. I want this to look a little bit indented in compared to the rest of it. So I started with the B97. I'm going to blend that out with the B95, B93, and then leave that very strong center highlight for the B91. That way there's going to be quite a bit of a difference between these middle little sections here and the rest of the vase. So once that's done, we are going to move on to this. I believe it's supposed to be a lemon. At least that's the way we're going to color it. And I'm going to do something very similar as I did with the bananas. I'm going to use that scary E99 again. And I'm going to add little specks with the Y26, which is the camera really doesn't pick up too much. But I'm going to go back in with that Y11 to brighten everything up. Next, I am going in with my reds. You can see I'm saving my reds till last. So for this first apple, I am just going to start off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. I'm going to add a little bit of shading to either side, and I'm also going to create a shadow where this other apple is in front of this one. So that would naturally have a shadow there. I'm going to blend that out with the R46, the R24, and then finish off with the highlight color, that R22. This is my favorite red combination, and I'm sure you guys all know that by now. And for this apple that is cut in half, I just want to make sure that I'm not putting 2 of the darkest areas directly next to one another. It doesn't really matter where you put your shadows, to be honest, as long as your 2 darkest areas aren't touching. So where I added that shadow for that apple in the back, I'm just making sure that my shadow for this front apple is not touching. And that's the way you're going to be able to get that dimension. For these 2 apples in the basket, there was really no way of not putting the 2 darkest areas next to one another without creating a strong highlight. So that's what I'm going to do. For this whole apple, or the one that we see the whole apple of, I am going to add my shading to both sides, but I'm leaving just a little bit of a gap off to the right-hand side. That way I don't have 2 of the darkest areas directly next to one another. And we're just going to enhance that highlight later on once we bring in the white gel pen. Now I'm going to keep the same color combination for the flowers themselves. And I'm not really doing anything different here, so I'm only going to show you one flower. I'm going to start with this first petal. I'm going to start with my darkest color because I want to maintain the texture. But once again, it is intimidating. It looks intimidating, but I'm just using the lines that are within the image to add my shading and my shape of the petal. So where I see the flick lines, I'm adding a little bit of my darkest color, and I'm just going to blend that out as I go down to the lightest color. The only thing that you want to remember is that as you blend out these flick lines that are adding texture to your petals, is that you want to blend it out in the same direction each time. It doesn't matter necessarily what direction you choose, but if you add your flick line and then start with your darkest midtone to the right, you also want to add your lightest midtone to the right. It doesn't matter if the next flick line is to the left and the next one is to the right again, as long as you're keeping consistent with that particular line. So you can see that I'm adding some shading where the petals are coming out from the other petals. So the back petals are going to naturally appear a little bit darker. The highlight is not going to be quite as strong there, but it's pretty much the same thing for all of these flowers. They are a little bit different from one another, but for the most part, your shading and your contrast is going to be pretty much the same. So once I have all of my images colored, I am going to color in my table. And I was originally going to do this wood green, but I kind of messed up a little bit and I felt like I had so much going on that I just ended up just doing it brown. So I'm going to start with my lightest color here, and I'm going to add shadows underneath each one of my objects. Shadows can be a little intimidating as well, but when you think of it as just a scribble, it's really not too hard. I'm also going to add some contrast or some dimension to the back of the table, and this is where I accidentally touched that red, and you can see that I dragged it out. I have a little bit of that red on the tip of my marker now, so I'm just going to take a scrap piece of paper and just scribble off until I can no longer see that red. This is the reason why I save my reds for last, because if you accidentally tap or touch a little bit of that red, you're going to drag it everywhere. So next I can go in with my darkest brown, and I'm just going to go over those shadow areas. Now, like I said, the shadows are just basically scribbles. You just want to go with the direction of the image itself. If you have a light source, your shadow is just going to be the opposite of that light source. So for example, if your light source is in the top right, your shadows are going to be in the bottom left. In this case, I didn't really have any light source. I kind of just added my shading wherever I felt like it. So that makes my shadows a lot easier. I'm also going to add a little bit of this darker brown to the back of the table. As you look at one single object, the further back it gets, the darker it will appear. So if you ever Google a scene, a beach scene, a desert scene, a whatever scene, the darker areas are going to be in the back. So as the grass or the water or the sand gets further back, it's going to appear darker. So that's exactly what I'm going to do with this table. And I am just going to blend these out each and every time with the E57, 55, and then finish with the E53. I'm also going to extend these shadows. And I'm extending them down and I'm extending them out. So I'm extending them in pretty much in every direction. And it's okay if you go over the darkest area with your lightest color in this particular instance, because it's a shadow. It's meant to look a little bit messy, so you really can't mess it up as long as you just blend it out each time. So as I bring down these colors, this is where I am going to begin to kind of touch some of these images. And I don't want to make the same mistake twice by dragging out any of the red or any of the other colors really. So when I go back in with this lightest color, I am being extremely careful and I'm working with small little sections at a time. That way I can take my time going around these images and then filling in the larger areas a little bit quicker. You still want to be super careful. If you happen to touch the red, just do what I did the first time. Take a scrap piece of paper, scribble off the excess ink that you have on the nib, and you should be good to go. This is why the tip to tip method for blending works so well, because that ink stays on the tip until you scribble it off. So if you've ever used the tip to tip method or seen it, this is why it works so well, but it can also be a curse. So once all of my coloring is complete, I am going to finish off with some white gel pen details to some of the fruit, because this is where the highlights would be the strongest, including this apple that we left that highlight off to the right-hand side with. Finishing off with the sentiment, I'm going to stamp that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink in the top left-hand corner, and that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.